Hello and welcome.
Be natural, Faranak, be natural. No, it's the chair.
Oh, my stomach is gonna go. What were we talking about?
What were we talking about?
Friend and colleague.
I was not paying attention. It's magic. It's all magic.
Hello and welcome. I'm Faranak Amidi, and today I'm getting ready with my friend and colleague Laura García from BBC Mundo.
Hola. Hola.
So, I know that in BBC Mundo you guys are super busy these days because you have a new president. Actually, your first female president.
In Mexico, my home country.
Yes.
It's huge.
I remember on her inauguration day, I saw you running around in BBC with your equipment, with your tripod and everything.
As I normally do,
Yes. You know, when she was elected, she had this really, really powerful speech. Mm-hmm. But tell me about it. What was it all about? And why was it so strong in your opinion?
So the speech that Claudia Sheinbaum, that's the name of our new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, la presidenta, which is an interesting thing in Spanish. We have gendered in words. So now people are getting used to saying presidenta in female rather than presidente in male. Anyway.
For the first time.
For the first time. That's a little tangent. In her speech, when she was elected and when she was inaugurated, Claudia repeated things like, I'm not getting here myself, we get here together.
What does she mean by that?
So she's trying to acknowledge the fact that she is the latest and will not be the last of a long list of women that have kind of campaigned and fought for women's rights in Mexico. And I think that's how she started one of the parts of her speech where she goes, I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a scientist, and now I'm also president. All of these in the female form of the word, was in Spanish is really interesting as a distinction, right? And those, whether you agree with her politics or not, I think it was definitely an important speech that spoke to a bunch of things we haven't heard from a president before, because we haven't had a woman president before.
So, you know, Laura, you grew up in Mexico.
Yep, born and bred.
Yeah. So tell me about what life is like as a woman and as a girl growing up in Mexico.
So life growing up as a woman in Mexico is complex. Like growing up as a woman anywhere, I don't think that's specific to
Tell me about it.
I don't think that's specific to Mexico, but I do remember now as an adult thinking back on when I was growing up, little things that you hear as a girl, little things my parents would say to me versus not to my cousins who are boys.
And you would pick it up.
Yeah, and at the time you're like, oh, it doesn't mean anything, or they're just trying to look after me, or they're being nice. But now that I think about it with like my grown-up brain, I go, well, maybe that's not something we should be telling little girls. And it's not just the experience of little girls, but Mexico as a country is really complex. We have some of the most horrible stats when it comes to gender-based violence. It's the second place for feminicides in Latin America after Brazil. So the reality isn't just like in the everyday micro interactions, but also in quite a systemic problem of violence against women.
So, you know, most societies and cultures, when you look at it, they have this thing called machismo. I mean, I come from Iran, so I had plenty of that around me when I was growing up in Iran. But how does it look like in your everyday life in Mexico, this machismo?
So I think it has those two sides that we were just talking about that I would notice growing up. One is a quite severe problem of violence that can turn into fatal violence towards women, which again is not just a problem of Mexico. This happens everywhere, right? And also in the everyday micro interactions. I'll give you an example. I've been living outside of Mexico now for 13 years. And every time I go back, I notice a bit more the things that I'm not used to hearing anymore.
Tell me about it.
So I've always wanted to go into television. I wanted to do it. And very early on, when I started working as a journalist in Mexico and wanting to go into broadcast, it was clearly said to me, well, no, it wasn't like said to me in that sense, but like I understood by how people were talking to me about it, that as a young woman, if I wanted to work in broadcast, I was either in a skirt in front of the camera or I wasn't in broadcast. I remember having my dad's grandma, and we got along really well. And one of the very few times that we fought is when I started to get a bit older and she wanted me to go for a whole summer to spend it with her so she could teach me how to be a good wife. She was like, I'm going to teach you to cook and wash and do all these things because you need to start thinking about it. And 13-year-old me thought it was wild. I just didn't want any of it. But then once I was a bit older and I could sit down and talk to her, she was like, well, in the world that I come from, being married is the only safety women get. My grandma was born before women could vote. My grandma was born in a Mexico where women couldn't have their own bank accounts without their husbands. And that's like 1953 women get the vote. 2024 we have a woman president. 2018 half of our Congress were women. Like the change is there and it is happening.
Is your grandmother alive now?
Not yet, not anymore. She passed away a couple years ago. But I remember when my dad called me to say that she'd passed, I was at Westminster in Parliament covering a snap election, I think. Anyway, and I thought it was really symbolic that I was doing the job I wanted to do, covering the most important story of the day in a country that wasn't mine, that I'd made the effort to migrate to, doing all these things that she in a way had fought for. It was, it's making me like...
I know.
Yeah, it felt like a nice moment of the things you fought for, I am here doing. Like your life was worth something. Look at what we're doing together.
Wow. Yeah, I totally understand. You know, when you were talking about it, that your grandma, you know, teaching you stuff like how to cook and how to clean the house. Yeah. I remember when I was growing up in Iran, it was the same, you know. Everybody expected you to know how to cook.
Yeah.
So when you were like a teenager.
As a mark, right? Of like you're becoming an adult, therefore you can cook.
Exactly. You're a woman. Do you know how to cook? Because if you get married, you have to know how to cook. When you get married, not if you get married. So I hated cooking. I would just avoid the kitchen at any cost. I would like starve, but not go into the kitchen.
That's really funny. I did the same. I couldn't like boil an egg until I was 25. Because
now I love cooking.
Same. And I also really regret not learning to cook from my granny because she was a great cook. But like at the time, I didn't want to hear it. I was like, this is not something I
totally understand. So, you know, Laura, you mentioned that systematic violence, the violence that women face every day in Mexico. And it is one of the worst countries in the world, as you mentioned, when it comes to violence against women and femicide. But how do people talk about it? Is it something that young women are aware of? Like when you go out, for instance, at night, is it something in the back of your mind?
So the conversation around gender-based violence and consent has really been changing. I remember when I moved to the UK, I was 24. We weren't talking about consent.
I don't think anybody was talking about it anywhere.
But now people are.
Yeah.
And not just consent, but the intersections of kind of women's rights and LGBTQI plus rights and Afro-Mexican communities, which we were never talking about before. And now Claudia Sheinbaum in her inauguration speech mentioned a couple times, which is huge. Nevertheless, for all the progress, there's still always... The conversation still is really complex. I'll give you an example. There was a very high-profile case in my hometown of Monterrey, which is in the north of Mexico, of this girl who went out with her mates. They went on a night out, and when they were about to leave, and it was like 3 or 4 in the morning, she says goodbye to her friends. They take a picture of her before she jumps in her cab home, and they never hear from her again. A couple days later, they found her body. And what was interesting, or what singled that case out, wasn't just the fact that she was 18 and she was in uni and she had her whole life ahead of her, but the conversation around that last picture her friends took before she got in the cab.
Oh, what was that?
She'd just come out from being on a night out. She had a short skirt on. She was wearing party clothes, as you do when you're out with your friends. And some people would criticize what she was wearing, saying, well, maybe she shouldn't have been wearing a short skirt. As if that was a direct correlation between, well, if you wear a short skirt, you're asking to be killed, right? And it was the picture that sparked the conversation. And I think that's still indicative how, for all the progress, there's still a lot of entrenched cultural assumptions and stereotypes of what women should and shouldn't do, what women should and shouldn't wear, what situations are safe or there aren't, and the responsibility and the burden placed on women to look after themselves, rather than why don't we make sure society isn't dangerous for anybody?
Yeah.
Not just women.
Exactly. And do you think that having a female president and other female high-level authorities in the country, politicians at the moment, would change this narrative and this discourse in the society?
So it's really hard to predict the future. But like you said, it's definitely, this is 100% an inflection point in history, because the president, the president of the Supreme Court, the mayor of Mexico City, which is like the most important.
A lot of powerful women.
And the head of the armed forces are all women.
Wow.
And that certainly means something in terms of representation. And is it going to change faster or not? We have to see. But what I do see from my reporting is that this is a change coming from lots of different places. So you have people fighting really hard to make sure that parties they are legally obligated to nominate 50% of women for all political posts. There was a fight to make sure that the word femicide was in the legal code, so that then these kind of types of acts of horrible gender-based violence can be counted and quantified and investigated. And all of these different intersections are driving change in different ways. Now, in the run-up to the election, which was historic, because from the get-go, we knew we were going to have a woman president. The two main candidates were women. There was no way, unless like something really, really, really unexpected happened, that a woman wasn't going to win.
Yeah.
I spoke to a bunch of like different... Oh, this is really hard to like do my eyeliner and talk at the same time.
you need
like,
proper
I need to
concentration.
No, I spoke to a bunch of women in different areas of Mexican life and in positions of certain power, right? So from a teacher who has power over a classroom to a former Olympian who now is a coach to a high-powered businesswoman, just to ask them what it meant for, like, what does it mean for you? What does it mean for you that we're going to have a woman president? And the conversations were really varied. Everyone agrees it's a landmark moment. Consensus there. We're all like, yep, this is important. It matters. This is super historic. But there was always a but.
What is that but?
Everyone had a different but. It was very interesting because their buts reflected the different complexities of being a Mexican woman. So someone was like, it's amazing we have a woman president, but I hope she doesn't forget about education for teenage mothers. It's amazing we have a woman president. I hope she remembers to fund science for women. It's amazing we have a woman president, but I hope they don't stop counting femicide so we can do more. There was always a but that reflects the kind of prism of challenges that Mexican women face. And it was really interesting to hear those conversations and be a part of them and seeing them reflected in my family group chats or online around what is undoubtedly a historical moment.
But there are so many intersections,
there's
so many layers and
exactly.
complexity. Yeah, that's very interesting. So it just shows that it's not only, people in Mexico don't think, oh, because this is a female president, she only has to think about women's rights and women's issues. No?
And that's something they said to me as well. They're like, look, she's president. We need to evaluate her as president. She's not just a woman. And that job and the criticism has to be there everywhere. And also a bunch of them said to me, well, we can't expect this one single woman to fix what is a humongous structural problem, right? So both the excitement and the expectation was always, always, always kind of like couched with a bit of realism that Claudia is there and she's a symbol and some people agree with her politics and some people don't. But there's loads of work to be done around and in the country, and having a female president doesn't magically fix everything.
Exactly. Let's talk about her inauguration day and her speech, her inauguration speech. So basically, it was a powerful speech as well, and I want you to talk about it. But I also want to talk about something I know is stereotypical, but we have to.
You're going to ask me about the dress.
Yes.
Oh my God, the dress was beautiful.
Yes, the dress. It was a gorgeous dress.
I feel terrible talking about it.
I know, but she did it. She wore it.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. Yeah.
And it's one of those, it's very symbolic, that dress. So, just run me through it. What does it say, this dress? And then we talk about her speech.
Okay, so the dress... actually, let me show you a picture of the dress.
Yes.
Just so we can remind ourselves what it looked like.
It is gorgeous.
Yeah, so it's like this off-white long dress and embroidered. And the embroidery is where the symbolism comes in, because
Tell me about it.
She had it made by an artisan in Oaxaca, a woman artisan who embroidered it in a style that is really particular to that state. And Oaxaca is known for its beautiful textile culture driven by women. The people who weave and embroider traditionally are women. And Claudia made a point of that in her speech when she was talking about the history of Mexico, as many presidents do when they come into office, like doing a little bit of a recount of her history and how we got here. She specifically mentioned the women who have threaded our history, talking about not just artisans, but the women who have been important in our history in a way that, I mean, I've listened to 4 or 5 presidential inauguration speeches. I don't remember anyone saying something like that specifically and that poignantly before. And it kind of all got tied into the dress. And she's been doing that throughout her campaign, making really specific choices, well, she and her team, of what she wears that represents not just the indigenous roots of the culture in Mexico, which are really important and are important to her to kind of, or the movement that she represents to kind of bring back to life, but specifically also the work of women.
And
love that lipstick.
See?
Beautiful.
I am
gorgeous.
Yes. Thank you. I love your makeup as well. What was the reaction to her speech? Was it well received?
That's a really interesting question. So, Claudia Sheinbaum comes from a political movement that is or was led by her predecessor, the previous president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador.
Yes.
And he is a person that left office with almost 70% of approval ratings.
Super popular.
Which is very popular. But he's also very unpopular with the people who don't like him. So he can be polarizing, or some people can criticize him for, or can say that. Because she has put herself in the middle of the movement that he led, and she has become an instrumental part of it. Whatever people think or thought of him can also be translated to her in lots of ways. So the people who really liked him really like her. People who really don't like him really don't like her. So the question of like, how was the speech received kind of a little bit depends on what party line you stood before. And the fact that she's the first woman president becomes a little bit of a side note. But that was the case ever since we had 2 of the main candidates be women.
Yeah, exactly. The gender is out of...
Which was really interesting. It just removed that out of the equation.
And so, obviously, a lot of people voted for her and like her, but there are people who are not a fan of her. What did they say about her?
As it happens in politics, right? So, Claudia's critics have like 3 broad criticisms of her, and they're also kind of inherited from her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who leads the movement.
Yeah.
The first criticism thrown at her is that she's just a carbon copy of him, and that she's doing whatever he asks him to do, right? That's the first criticism. The second criticism is a bit more wide about the party that she leads and represents, and how, because they have a working majority in Congress and an important part of a bunch of the state legislatures, they can pass laws really quickly. And it worries some people, and critics say that maybe gives them unchecked power to do change really quickly. And then the third criticism, and I'm overgeneralizing, by the way, that people have with Claudia is about her manner. She's very serious. She's very methodical. She will say what she thinks. She can be very direct. And this is not common at all in Mexican society, but less from women. And she has acknowledged it. She's just like
sexism sneaking in there.
Yes, she has said it. She's like, people call me cold Claudia, or serious Claudia. But that comes from her background. I mean, number one, it's who she is, and that's it. But it also comes from her background as a scientist.
Yeah.
She's an academic. She's methodical. She likes the data. She likes working from data. In those conversations that I had with women before she was elected, there were 2 really key phrases that stood out to me. Apart from everybody recognizing how much of a historical moment this is, one of the women that I interviewed said, "This is great. Amazing. First woman president. Very excited. I'm way more excited about who becomes president in 2060. The boy or girl who grows up in a country where it's just normal to see a woman giving presidential morning press briefings, where it's just, where gender maybe comes out of that equation and they can imagine themselves in a completely different country.
And that's why you understand why this is such a landmark moment for the country, for any country, really.
And you can see it in places like Chile, for example, where Michelle Bachelet was the president, and not just the excitement on the ground, but how it started to transform the configuration of visibility and representation and access to politics and all that kind of stuff is really important. And then the second phrase that really stuck to me came from a feminist academic who said, feminine body does not guarantee feminist thought.
Exactly.
And it's important to keep that in mind, both because the fact that she's the first woman to be president just gives her the responsibility of being president. And also that doesn't necessarily have to reflect in her policies. She wasn't known as a mayor of Mexico City for having like super feminist policies or very focused on women.
Did she do anything for women in Mexico City, for instance, for their safety and security? Did she try to make Mexico City a little safer for women?
Yeah, she did. She did. But she also had, for example, whenever there were International Women's Day marches in Mexico, which can sometimes involve clashes with police, she would be quite hard on the security part and not necessarily on the kind of protesters part. That is changing a little bit, and we just have to see how her policies develop from here on. When she was inaugurated, not only did she talk a lot about like the history of women in Mexico, but she talked about how we need to recognize unpaid labor that women do. Yeah. She announced that women between the ages of 60 and 64 will be able to get, it's almost like a state pension to recognize all the unpaid work they've done throughout their lives. So those policies are starting to shine through. It's just because it wasn't necessarily what drove her agenda in Mexico City. The other thing that she's the first to is that it's the first time we have a Nobel Prize winning climate scientist as president. Her career in politics has been parallel to her career in academia. Her interest had always been in the climate. She did a bunch of things when she was mayor of Mexico City. She was part of the IPCC panel that won the Nobel Peace Prize for their work on climate. So the expectations on Claudia are not just of the presidency as a whole, with all the challenges that anybody would face, men or women, man or woman, but also because she's a woman and because she's a climate scientist. And we have seen bits of what she's starting to trail on both ends. So for example, in Mexico City, she encouraged people to use bicycles a lot. And that really helped make the city a bit greener and cleaned up the river. She wants to scale that up to country size. But Mexico City and the entirety of a country are completely different things. And the same thing for her policies aimed at women. So she worked on making Mexico City a safer city by collecting a bunch of data, by trying to kind of come up with social programs that go to the roots of insecurity. And she's going to try and do the same and scale it at a national level. She was talking about that recently, of how she's going to try and kind of emulate those plans. Because she's a scientist, she's driven by data, and she talks about that. She wants to see the numbers. She wants to try things. She does things very scientifically. It's just about waiting to see what the first woman president, who's also a climate scientist, does for the next 6 years of her presidency, which is how long she's got.
Definitely. We're going to have our eyes on Claudia Sheinbaum.
Exactly.
Now that we are ready, makeup done.
Gorgeous. Gorgeous.
Let's do a selfie. That's a good angle.
I'm still baffled by that you've done it with your hands.
See,
you're going to teach me how to do that.
Darling, this is my phone.